My name is Jenny Maths. It's May 21st, 2015, and it is an honor and privilege to be interviewing Jorge Ramos.
My pleasure. Great to have you here.
And we are at Univision Studios in Doral, Florida.
We are. Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Here you go.
You want another kick?
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
So we're going to start at the very beginning. Can you tell us what was your name at birth and when and where you were born?
Let me first say that I can define myself in many different ways. In my profession, I'm an immigrant and a journalist. And as a person, I have to define myself as the son of Jorge and Maria and the father of Nicolas and Paola. So I was born Jorge Gilberto Ramos. I inherited the Gilberto, the middle name, because my grandfather had it and then my father had it. And I just didn't want to be like them. But I was born Jorge Gilberto Ramos. And at the end, there are so many Jorge Ramos in this world that it helped me go through faster through airports. So now I'm using Gilberto.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Mexico City.
Mm-hmm. And what did your parents do? What were their names, full names, and what did they do for a living?
My mom stayed at home, and she became eventually a rebel because she didn't want to live like that and ended up going to college with us at the same time. And my father was an architect who really didn't want to be an architect and who wanted to be a magician, but he needed the courage to become a magician, and he just never got that courage.
Did you have siblings, and what were their names?
We are 5. I'm the oldest, Jorge, Alejandro, the second one, Eduardo, Gerardo, and Lourdes. I don't know exactly how my mom did it, but it was one after the other. It is incredible. And back then, obviously, it was a different culture and a different tradition. But my father kept on looking for a daughter. And until he got a daughter, then they stopped. They stopped having kids.
Do you think you inherited any traits from your parents?
Many of them. I'm a reflect of my father and my mother. I think I'm closer to my mother, that rebel spirit that she is. And I think I grew up against my father. He was an authoritarian figure. He, following the traditions in Mexico, he was a very strong father who didn't like dissent. And I only had 2 options, either to be like him or to confront him. And at the end, I ended up confronting him. And because of that, and because of the Catholic school where I went to, where we were going through really difficult situations because the leaders of the school were priests who would physically punish us. And at the end, I also had the opportunity either to submit to their orders or to rebel against them. So I rebelled against the priest in school, and I rebelled against my father, and that was the perfect background for becoming a journalist. I didn't know it back then, but thanks to my father and thanks to the impositions of Catholic school in Mexico City, I ended up being a journalist.
What were your interests growing up? What were your hobbies?
Only football. In other words, soccer or football. I wanted to be a soccer player. That was the only interest in my life. And we would play on the streets, and we would play in school, and we would wait for recess just for that moment in which you could go out and play football, soccer. That's the only thing I wanted to be in my life. There was a wonderful soccer player called Enrique Borja in the Mexican League, and I just wanted to be like him. That was the only interest in my life when I was very, very young.
So what happened?
What happened is that as I grew up, I understood that I was going to need much more than soccer to express myself. I tried guitar, classical guitar. As a matter of fact, I studied classical guitar for many, many years, and it was not enough. And then at the end, I understood that soccer was not enough, guitar and music was not enough, that I needed to raise my voice to do something. And that's where I think, when I think that I found journalism and writing.
Were you, did you have any access to American television or American news or?
We were invaded by American television in Mexico, and I still remember that the radio stations only played American music. It was a very short period in Mexican history, but back then it was only music in English. So all the shows that people watched when they were growing up here in the United States, we were watching them either with subtitles over there in Mexico. All of them.
Do you remember one of the first
Yeah,
your
I mean,
favorites?
the Addams Family, I still remember seeing that, and all the cartoons, and all the football games. For one reason, I don't know exactly why, but people love to watch the Dallas Cowboys, and everybody in Mexico followed the Dallas Cowboys. So every single day, I would be exposed to American media without even knowing. I thought, obviously, when you were a kid, you had no idea, but I thought that's what every kid in the world would watch. And of course not. I was watching American television in Mexico, and at the end, it would have been impossible for me to imagine back then that I was going to be a journalist in the United States.
Mm. So where did you go to school, and what did you decide to study at school?
I didn't study journalism. I didn't want to cover journalism. I didn't want to be a journalist. I didn't want to cover the news. I wanted to be the news. At some point, I thought that I wanted to be a politician. And as a young student, every young student, I thought, wanted the same, which was to change the world. And I thought that the only way to do that was to get involved in politics. So I studied a lot of political science and psychology, and that was my whole intention, to do something with my life and to try to change what was going on around me. Remember, I was growing up in a very poor country with a lot of corruption, with no democracy. And as a young student, there are many things that I wanted to change. So I didn't want to be a journalist. And I had the opportunity to be a journalist, but I decided not to do that. The first time that I was exposed to journalism is when I was a kid, when my mom told me that if I would read the editorial pages of the newspaper, that I would know everything. And I was intrigued. So every day I would go to the editorial pages and try to find out what was going on in the world. And back then, the writers were not very direct, and it was very difficult to find out exactly what was going on. But I grew up reading the editorial pages and filling the paper every single day. We would receive the paper, and I would see it and touch it and go through it until I would find the editorial pages. That was the first time I was exposed to that. And even now, I tell my mother that was a wonderful gift, because I ended up being an editorial writer. And not only I'm a TV journalist, but I have a weekly column. And that's what I found, that it's directly linked to my childhood, to what my mom told me that I was supposed to do. And I keep on doing it.
So your first professional job, 1978, Televisa, in radio. Can you talk about how that came about?
I needed money to go to college. We didn't have, we were 5 kids. I was going to be the first one going to college, and we needed money. There was no other way. I got a scholarship for the first semester, and then we had no money to keep on paying for college. So I needed a job. A friend of mine told me that his mom needed someone to help them in a travel agency, and I love traveling because I couldn't travel. And so I started working in a travel agency, and then a couple of years into college, somebody told me that there was going to be that they were offering an internship in the largest radio station in Mexico. And I thought that was going to be closer to my career in communication and politics than working in a travel agency. So I applied, and they took me. They took a team of about 10 students who were going to be trained and then move into either radio or television. So I ended up working for the largest radio network in Mexico, and I started helping other writers and helping other journalists. But I also tried to be on the air. But the news director, I remember, he told me that he didn't like my voice, and that I would never go on the air in radio. And I didn't say anything, but I knew that he was wrong. I knew that he was wrong.
Set out to correct it for...
Absolutely. At some point, he knew that my career was flourishing and that his career was ending. But after he said that, 1981, March 30th, 1981, there was the assassination attempt against President Ronald Reagan here in the United States. So this is what happened. He called everyone in the newsroom, and he asked them, among all of you, I think we were talking about 20, 30 people, who speaks English? And then 10 people raised their hands. I had studied English for a couple of years in elementary school, so I remember a little bit. And then he asked, and who has the passport ready? And I was the only one. So among all of them, I was the only one who spoke a little English and who had the passport ready. And I was sent from Mexico City all the way to Washington, D.C. to cover the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan. And I had no experience whatsoever. I had never been on the air. I had never been a correspondent. I had never been a writer. And I was sent to cover one of the most important stories in that decade. And I tried to do my best. And when I came back, that changed everything. I realized that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I wanted to be in the place where the world was changing, and Washington was the place where the world was changing. I wanted to get to know the people who was changing the world, and journalism gave me that opportunity. And I realized very fast that was going to be my opportunity to travel around the world, and that was going to be my opportunity to escape Mexico. Mexico was not a democracy. Mexico was a very repressive place with a lot of censorship. And I realized that journalism was going to save me. And at the end, of course, it has saved me.
Now, having had no experience, how did you, sort of the trial by fire of learning how to develop a story, come up with a beginning, middle, and end, deliver it, communicate it?
This is what I did. I turned on the TV in the hotel, and I listened to what other reporters were doing, and then I went out to report the story in front of the hospital where President Reagan was being taken care of, and I started imitating what I was watching on American television, and that's how I learned. And I was going to say that I had no fear, but I think I knew that I was going to be able to do it, but I conquered the fear that I had, and I started asking people what they thought about what was going on. And at the end, either luck or persistence, but I found a nurse that was taking care of President Reagan. She was dressed as a civilian, and she started talking to me and telling me what was going on inside the hospital. And that was just a fascinating story, a great story, to know it directly from the nurse. And I, obviously it was not the best reporting that I could have done, but I learned it firsthand, and I loved it. I loved the independence of being a journalist. I loved the fact that I was in the place where the rest of the world was paying attention to, and that changed my whole life.
Now, how did you make the transition to television after this, when you came back? After
being a correspondent, or a foreign correspondent for just a few days, I knew that I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. My father wasn't very happy because my father wanted me to be an architect like him, an engineer, an attorney, or a doctor. Those were the only legitimate professions back then in Mexico. When I told him that I was going to get into communications, he told me, what are you going to do with that? And I remember how he emphasized that. He knew that it was going to be difficult. Journalists in Mexico got no respect because they were working directly with the government. And probably he didn't want me to be a censored journalist. But after the experience in Washington, I became aware that that's exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I didn't pay attention to my father. I rebelled against him again. And then I applied for a job on TV. I knew back then, it was very clear that television was the place to be. That's where the power was. That's where the influence was. And so I moved from radio to television as a writer, working for a newscast. I started as a writer, and then eventually there was an opening in a show in Mexico called 60 Minutos, which is 60 minutes. They needed.
But it's not the same 60 Minutes. It's not a spin-off.
It's not the same 60 Minutes, although they tried to do something similar. But it wasn't. And I applied for 60 Minutes, and they needed young reporters, and they hired me. So I thought it was fantastic. I had covered the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan. I moved to television. I was hired as a television correspondent. I was 23, barely, 24, and life was great. But life was not great because I was working for a television network, as any other television network and radio network in the country, that was completely censored by the government. So I did my first report on martial arts, which have nothing to do with real journalism. And on my second report, I almost died because we covered a volcano eruption in southern Mexico, in Chiapas, and the Chichonal volcano. And I wanted to prove to everyone that I was such a good reporter, that we went so close to where the eruption had occurred that we almost died. Thanks to some campesinos, farm workers, they helped us go back to the closest town. But it was it was not intelligent, not smart at all what we did. And then my third report, I thought everything was going to be great. And then my third report, I decided to do a story about how the president is chosen in Mexico and what Mexicans thought about that process, which was called dedazo, which means basically a finger, how a president chooses who's going to be succeeding him with a finger, saying, you're going to be the one following me. There was no democracy. So I thought, it's great. I'm going to do real journalism. Let's denounce what's going on in Mexico. So I travel around the country interviewing people. I talked to two writers who were very critical of the Mexican presidential system, and I did my report. After I did my report and everything was taped, one of the senior producers of the show saw what I had done. He talked to the director of the program. He talked to the news director, and they came back to me and said, we can't air that because the people you talk to, the intellectuals, the writers, they don't represent the system, and we simply cannot do that. We can't air what you want to do. So we made some changes to the script, and they still didn't like it. And at the end, I was forced to voice over the report, which had absolutely nothing to do with my original reporting and didn't include the writers that were critical to the president. And I quit. I knew that I was... Many people thought that I was crazy. I was already working for the largest television network in Mexico. I was probably one of the youngest reporters. I had a future in front of me. And I just didn't want to be a censored journalist. It was not a difficult decision. Again, I was 24, so before I was fired, because I was going to be fired because I didn't want to track what they had told me, I wrote my letter of resignation, and I sent it to the owner of the company. And I still remember that letter of resignation as probably one of the bravest moments in my life. Mm. And I still remember that as a badge of honor. Thanks to that, I think I became the journalist that I am right now. So I quit. I had no job, no money. Nobody wanted to hire me because I had done what no other young journalist wanted to do. So I had no future in Mexico. Nobody would hire me. I sold my car. I had an old Volkswagen Beetle, a red one, a beautiful car. I still remember that. I got about $2,000. I tried to go to any college or university who would accept me. And I applied to UCLA Extension in Los Angeles. They accept me for a one-year program in television and journalism. And with that, I moved to the United States. It was January 2nd, 1983. I remember that moment perfectly because I arrived at LAX and it was in the afternoon. The sun was going down, looks like a movie, but I still remember that. And everything that I owned, absolutely everything that I owned, my guitar, my bag, some of my papers, everything that I owned, I was able to carry that. Just imagine the sense of freedom that gave me. Just imagine that everything that you have could be with you. So that's how I started here in the United States. I came as a student. I thought it was going to be only for a year and then come back. And that year became 2 and 3, and it's been decades here in the United States.
And how did you first get the job at Canal 34, which, if you could explain, was the local affiliate for our scene?
Oh,
so sorry.